All right, folks, we're going to get started. So thanks for joining today. Welcome to the TBR webinar series. Today, I'm going to be talking about the telecom industry from our predictions report. So our 2021 predictions report. This webinar is based off of what was in that report. We're going to keep questions for the end. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And a couple of housekeeping notes. The bottom of your screens, you're going to see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. And after the webinar, you're going to receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. We also post these to YouTube. TBR has a YouTube channel where you can find this one, as well as the hundreds of other webinars that TBR has posted there to that portal. So I'm going to jump into the material here. So this is me, Chris Antlitz. I'm a principal analyst in the telecom practice at TBR. There's my email address. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to. And we're going to start off with setting the stage. And then we're going to go into three predictions that we made. There's many other things that we wanted to talk about. There's so much going on in this industry, all kinds of stuff. We had to pick three topics that we thought were the heaviest hitting. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So we've had COVID in 2020. That shook up quite a bit. The status quo. We have a new normal, some structural changes that we see taking place in the economy, in society, and this implicates the telecom industry as well. What we've seen in the past year is that telcos have been forced to go all in on digital transformation. So we see this in their retail operations. We see this in their field operations. We see this in their contact centers. We see this in other areas of their business operations, as well as how they interface with vendors and how work gets done. Telcos have had to make major changes, as well as other companies as well. But the point I want to make here is that digital transformation was something that was on roadmaps, and it was being dealt with in a more gradual manner, I would say, especially relative to what we see in other verticals. Telco tends to move a little slower. But what we saw in the past 12 or so months is an acceleration, a pull forward, if you will, in roadmaps. And we've also seen governments step in to stimulate the market, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So the pandemic, I want to start off here setting the stage. This virus is not going away anytime soon. It's probably going to be like the flu, where it comes back every season. There'll be different strains of it. This is just like the flu behaves. We're going to be dealing with this at least through 2021 before the vaccine distribution process is at a point where herd immunity can be achieved. So we're looking at least through this year before we get any semblance of herd immunity. That's what we're basing off of current research, current information that's coming out from governments and entities like the CDC and the EU. There's a new normal settling in. Economies and societies are making structural changes. So all kinds of examples of this. Population shifts. We see people leaving Tier 1 cities. They're moving outside of the cities. New York City alone, it's been estimated at least 400,000 people have permanently left New York City now, moved to other areas. Connecticut has been a big destination. Florida has been a huge destination for New Yorkers leaving the state. We see similar patterns in other Tier 1 cities, Chicago, San Francisco, London. People moving to the West Midlands, other areas of the UK. We see similar patterns. So there's a population redistribution, if you will, that's going on, and that's a global phenomenon. That's a structural change. We're seeing that impacting office real estate, retail real estate, mall centers, et cetera. That also impacts telcos indirectly, right? These are their customers providing connectivity services to. These are things that the telcos need to deal with as well. CSPs are transforming to adapt to the new normal. So we see investment patterns changing. There's a doubling down on RPA, on automation, on leveraging new technology, leveraging the cloud, SaaS-based models. We see some telcos starting to dabble a little bit more there, moving a little bit faster than before. A lot more work needs to be done there, though. But the point I want to make is that there's been a acceleration in the movement over the past 12 months or so. Governments. We're going to be talking a lot about governments today. There is an unprecedented amount of money that is sloshing around the global economy. At the time we wrote this report in October of 2020, there was an estimated $20 trillion in capital that materialized as part of COVID recovery packages. Of that $20 trillion, by the way, that number is now around $25 trillion. Since October, it's gone up about another $5 trillion. A lot of that is from the recent packages that the states just passed. But there's also been some packages in Taiwan and a couple of other countries. That money, a portion of that money is going directly into the ICT sector. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about what that means for this industry. But what I want to stress here is that there is no historical parallel for what's going on right now. And I think the market is greatly underestimating how much money is coming into this sector for infrastructure development, for Open RAN and driving Open RAN and standards-based infrastructure programs, for driving private networks, 5G, quantum computing, all of these things that will implicate telco industry. There is a huge amount of support coming into this market. And it's across numerous countries. This is not just a few countries. This is many countries. And CSPs are going to be among the key beneficiaries of the support. We're going to talk about the support, okay? So let's put a pin in it. So let's jump into the predictions. We're going to talk about government money first. And why are the governments bringing all this money to market? By the way, that $25 trillion that materialized in the last 12 months, that's about 25 to 30% of global GDP, just to put that in context, at 2019 levels. In 2019, global GDP was around $90 trillion. So essentially what's happened in the last 12 months is the governments have collectively put in about 25% to a third of an annual GDP amount, and they're pushing that into the market. It's a replacement of demand that was impacted by the fallout of the pandemic. Just to give you an idea of magnitude. The money is going into various programs, one of which is ICT, as we talked about before. This is about national agendas. This is about protecting the societies from the health threat. This is about also economic competitiveness and how technology, there's a tech arms race, if you will, to make sure that countries are keeping pace with each other so that they're competitive on the global stage. And then, again, the CSPs, but some of this money is coming into the telecom industry. 5G, AI, and edge computing are three key areas that are specifically outlined in certain government packages, specifically mentioned and actually talked about quite at length in some of those bills. on how that money is going to be allocated and how that's intended to stimulate those sectors. Okay, how much money are we talking about for ICT specifically? So again, this is based on October, okay? These numbers have gone up since then. As of October, about 1.4, so let me take a step back. Of the $25 trillion that has been earmarked globally, we estimate around $2 trillion of that is going directly into the ICT ecosystem, okay? That is for chip manufacturing, that's for quantum computing research, that is for edge computing, it's for 5G, AI programs, and a whole host of other technology initiatives. So again, 5G is part of that. We expect that $2 trillion number to go up to about $3 trillion within the next 2 years. And the reason for that is we believe the Western governments are going to have to double down and really scale up some of these packages to stay competitive with what's going on in Asia. And I think this pie chart conveys the urgency that certain governments might feel to respond to what's going on in other parts of the world. So there's pressure. There's pressure to spend here. And that money is going to start flooding the market this year. In China, it already started last year. That money started flowing in. This year, you're going to see a big amount of money going into the Western markets, and China's ramping up what they started last year. That $2 to $3 trillion amount that we expect is going to be spent between 2021 and the middle of this decade. So that money that's been allocated is going to come into the market over the next 5 years, starting in earnest this year. Okay, so I want to be crystal clear about timing here. It takes time for some of this money to get out into the market. It takes time for infrastructure projects to get off the ground, to be completed. There's a duration there, and that is built into these timelines. So when we look at the distribution of where the money is being spent, you can see here that more than 2/3 is coming directly from one country, and then the rest, the balance of that is the Western countries. That rest of world is pretty much those countries that we got listed there. So that's Australia, Canada, the EU. There is a ton of money the EU is bringing into the market, hundreds of billions of dollars into the ICT sector as part of those COVID recovery packages that the EU signed later last year. India, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and United Kingdom, all those countries are part of that rest of world. They make up the bulk of that rest of world number. Again, those numbers have increased since October. Taiwan, for example, just made an announcement a few days ago that there's going to be stimulus package for 5G edge, and there was a couple of other technologies that they specified. So this is moving. Okay, so this support, like these are big numbers, like where is this money going, right? How does it get spent? Who gets it? Where is it going? We gave some ideas here, examples of where we see the money going to be going, and the objectives that it's being justified on. So the government needs to have reasons for spending this money, right? Bridging the digital divide, nationwide coverage, economic competitiveness, public safety, national security reasons. These are some of the ones that we hear about most frequently as part of these, where this money is materializing. That money gets distributed in numerous ways. Tax breaks. Just last week, two companies, Samsung and TSMC, announced that they're going to be building some of the most advanced semiconductor production facilities in the world in Texas, and I think Arizona is the other one, the other state. they're receiving massive government stimulus to build those factories in the States. Huge amounts of money that's being mounted for building those factories and making sure that they're being built where governments want them built. There's direct payments, there's transfer payments, there's low or no interest credit lines, there's grants, which grants is a form of direct payment. You have subsidy payments. We see energy subsidies being utilized in certain countries. In some cases, we see base stations being partially paid for in areas like China, where the municipality will actually pay the telco to meet certain implementation targets for getting 5G radio coverage out in their respective municipality. There's also regulatory reform. That's a non-monetary stimulus mechanism, but it's extremely important because it lessens the red tape to getting infrastructure out in the field and operationalized. There's also spectrum terms that are more favorable in certain countries, especially for private spectrum. Another really non-monetary one, but one that's very important. And then heavy R&D subsidies for domestic technology research and other related programs. So these are just a few of the ways that money gets distributed in the economies. It's going into a variety of different things. 5G equipment, so we talked about RAN being subsidized in certain areas. Mobile core, there could be incentives around that for network slicing, shared mechanisms where infrastructure is shared. Site development costs, so power, energy subsidies to get more power lines over to cell sites or new cell sites. Chipset manufacturing is a big one. Big headlines coming out about that. We just talked about two of them, but there's others. Endpoint devices, chipset development for a whole host of devices, bringing chip prices down so that consumer electronics market can be stimulated. Adoption rates can scale faster. R&D flows into all kinds of different research programs, quantum computing, blockchain, 5G for Open RAN. That's a big one. The UK, the States, there's money available, public money available for stimulating that ecosystem. And then technology trials. Here again, we see the UK, Australia, those other countries that are paying for or heavily defraying the cost of experimentation. We see that in areas such as private cellular networks where the enterprise and our telco come together, get stimulus from the government to experiment with how 5G could be used to make manufacturing more competitive on the world stage. I just want to couch this in saying that government support of technology industry is not a new thing. This has happened over the last decades. You know, we can look back in time with the space program in the 60s and 70s. We can look to other historical situations where similar types of things happened. What I want to convey here, though, is that the magnitude has no historical parallel for what is currently going on. The amount of money, the pervasiveness of the involvement, and how much of the technology ecosystem is being impacted by this has no historical parallel. That's what I really want to stress that here. Okay, so the other thing that we see, moving on to the second prediction, is around spectrum policy. Now, this is really interesting because what we're seeing is spectrum's being increasingly democratized. So the traditional model is the telco has to pay big bucks to get spectrum at auctions. Unfortunately, that's what we're seeing with CBRS, and how much money is having to be spent on that. But there is many and a growing number of situations where spectrum can be had for free or close to free, where you can use unlicensed spectrum, such as 2.4, 5, 6 gigahertz, 60 gigahertz. There's other bands as well, depending on the market. You can also use aspects of other types of spectrum like CBRS, where you have the GAA tranche, which is open for anybody to use. It's the unlicensed portion. The point I want to stress here is there is democratization of spectrum is a trend. This is not just happening in places like Germany and the States. There are many countries where governments are actively looking at spectrum policy and making spectrum either low cost or free to use to basically anybody that wants to. But enterprises are very much in focus here. CSPs actually face a risk here of being disintermediated in the ecosystem by other companies that can access the spectrum for their own purposes, where they can circumvent having to go the licensed spectrum route and can get source spectrum from other means. We see this already happening in the States, right, with CBRS. I mean, there's several examples now that are public where this is happening. The enterprise is using CBRS, they don't need the telco, and they're going around them using other partners. So this is a risk for telcos. Okay, there are over 20 countries now that have spectrum, either it's already available or it will be available in the near future for either low cost or no cost to the ecosystem. And the key reason they want to do this is to ensure that the technology ecosystem is stimulated, right? They want to make sure that there's no burdens, no hindrances that would stifle technological advancement of their country. So this is a big, big deal, and it heavily influencing spectrum policy. You notice here, there are countries from all over the world. All regions are represented here. This is not just developed markets. Emerging markets are also playing a key role in taking a hard look at spectrum policy and bringing and starting to change things. Things are changing. Starting small, right? In many cases, this is just one or two bands that are going to be started with. But I think that this is a trend. This is a sustained trend. And we're going to see spectrum democratization become a big deal as this decade moves on. 6 gigahertz is a game changer. And that might be one of the few bands that has most countries globally synchronized on it. That has important implications for innovation and scale in the ecosystem, and also bringing down cost of infrastructure, cost of devices with the chipsets. You can mass produce chipsets that don't use as many frequency bands. You know, something like 6 gigahertz needs to be watched very closely, and how that will really change the spectrum ecosystem. Okay, so moving on to the third prediction. So 5G SA has legs. This is moving. We had a few operators launch commercial 5G SA networks last year with live traffic running on it. There's going to be a bunch more this year. I think just yesterday, one of the Korean operators said they launched theirs. So this is happening. The point I want to stress here is that this is not just about revenue generation or the hope for revenue generation. This is very much being driven by cost efficiency and coverage optimization. A lot of people don't think about this, but the 5G core is actually, it creates a situation where operationally it makes better use of spectrum assets. It increases the cell coverage radius from the tower, and there is other efficiency gains that are yielded by the telco by implementing this. This is very attractive for telcos that are facing higher than normal traffic levels from the new normal, and this is a way for them to, at relatively lower cost, get some efficiency gains and leverage out of their existing infrastructure. This is exactly what we're seeing certain telcos do, like T-Mobile, right? if you look at the press releases and what T-Mobile said about why they decided to go all in with SA earlier rather than later, is for just this reason, right? This is very much in line with operationalizing and getting the benefits that a 5G core can bring. Other telcos are waking up to this, and we're seeing real traction here. We're seeing roadmaps being pulled forward in several countries now. We see this. And the network slicing and all that stuff will come, but the point I want to stress is that the initial justifications to spend the money and to get it in place sooner rather than later is the cost efficiency side versus the revenue generation side, which is expected to come later. Okay, so who's doing this? When? What's the timing? So 2019, all 5G deployments in 2019 were NSA. There were no SA deployments in 2019, mostly because standards weren't ready yet. 3GPP wasn't ready yet with the core to do a full standalone system. 2020, the standards were ready, and we saw some operators in certain countries start to deploy those systems, very small scale. But this year, we're going to see not only more operators in more countries start to deploy commercial 5G SA networks. We're also going to see the initial builds start to really scale. We talked about T-Mobile. That is probably going to be the largest implementation globally in terms of the speed with which they've scaled that platform. And then there's also going to be select countries in Europe that deploy this year. Again, roadmaps are being pulled forward. This is what we're seeing. You know, in certain cases, I'll give you an example without naming specific operators, but there were some situations where operators were saying, no, we're going to do 2022. That's when we're planning on our roadmap to do SA deployment. Now what we're hearing is, well, we're going to pull it forward, you know, about a year or 18 months or so from what we were originally planning. And we're hearing that increasingly. So that's a trend. That's a prediction for this year. That's going to get some really, really good traction. Okay, so that was the predictions. I want to make it known. A bunch of the folks on this call have subscriptions to TVR Research. The predictions that we shared are based off of reports that we have in our syndicated portfolio. These are the reports that we pulled from. If you guys want to see more information, more commentary around these types of things or tangential things, I would highly recommend taking a look at these reports. And with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. Plenty of time for questions, so feel free to send over questions. So the first question is, are the slides going to be made available? So yes, if you want the slides, you need to email. I'm going to give you the email address. It's webinars@tbri.com. So again, if you want the slides, you need to email webinars@tbri.com. And we're also going to be making this available on YouTube. And you can also pull it down from our website if you so desire. Let's see here. Any other questions around what we talked about today? Okay, so the question about how to ask a question. So there's a list of buttons on the bottom of your screen, and you'll see something that says Q&A. If you press that button, for those of you who aren't familiar with this platform, if you press that button Q&A, you can type your question in the team chat, and then I'll get it on my side, and we can go through it one by one. So in case you're not familiar with using this platform, if you want to ask a question, go to the Q&A button at the bottom, and you can type in your question, and I'll get it. Okay, so there's some questions coming through now. So the first question is, any sense of the split of telecom investments in cloud versus non-cloud? So we do believe that the network is going into the cloud. This is inevitable. It just makes sense that this would be a natural architectural evolution of the network to go into a cloud-centric architecture that is cloud-native, virtualized, and microservices-based. Telcos are at the very early stages of trying to do something like this at scale, especially when we start thinking about more of the challenging aspects of the network, such as the core and the radio access layer. With that said, we do see the web scale companies positioning themselves and actively dialoguing with telcos about migrating, how to best migrate those functions into public cloud, or could be a hybrid or private cloud type of an environment. It's just a timing thing, but again, this is inevitable. The cloud is going, the networks will go into the cloud because it just makes sense to do that from an economic standpoint, from a scalability standpoint, from a digital transformation standpoint, for telcos to be equipped to become truly digital in nature. The cloud is a foundational component of a digital service provider. It's just the real question is around the timing. Now, in terms of investment, cloud versus non-cloud, the vast majority of telco investment today, if you look at their CapEx, most of that today is traditional architecture, on-premise, maybe some private cloud in there where they're running some functions out of that. You'll see a lot of virtual machine implementations from the early adopters there, like an AT&T or Verizon, where they started early on with NFV-SDN, with the Domain 2.0 program, Intelligent Edge, those types of things. During this decade, we're going to see that mix increasingly shift over to cloud emphasized. And I think that when we look at the 5G core and a 5G standalone network and the architecture that sits behind that, I think that 5G standalone networks are going to help accelerate the move into the cloud, because the way that the 5G core has been architected from the 3GPP, it is optimized if it's residing in that type of a framework. So I think we're going to see an acceleration into the cloud over the next few years in particular. Okay. So the next question is around, I'm going to go back to a prior slide. Of this ICT investment, the question is, oops. So the question is, of this $2 trillion or so dollars, how much of that is actually going to go into 5G? And we actually have done an analysis of that. So of the $2 trillion, so we did the analysis in October where we did the breakdowns. Of the $2 trillion, our estimate is around 300 or so billion of that is directly allocated for 5G. That goes into the RAN. That goes into things like Open RAN initiatives, joint innovation on private networks. That goes into site development related costs for the radio access layer. Those types of things are included in that several $100 billion estimate. Other large portions of that money is quantum computing, AI, edge computing, which also touches 5G. When you think about open virtual RAN and that architecture and how that implicates the edge, as well as network slicing and private networks. These all implicate the edge as well. So you can add to that number when you start to consider edge infrastructure. And then there's also other things in there like semiconductors, the factories that need to be built. All of those things are included in that $2 trillion. And that's kind of an idea of what the breakdown is and what's in that number, what the major drivers, components are of that number. Okay. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much for joining. Hope that you found this interesting. Again, if you want to get more information about any of the things we shared, you can go to the TBR website and pull down research from there. If you have a subscription, you can get the full reports provided to you. Just reach out and someone will get back to you about that. And I hope everybody has a great day and take care.